Hi there. In this, my latest installment of my compositional videos, I'm going to take time for a very brief recap. First of all, I started off complex with a lot of mathematics, at least that's the way people saw it. I looked at the image armature. Now, the image armature is simply a way of dividing up a frame that is especially well suited to the 3:2 ratio of 35mm. Now, you might say, what do you mean 35mm? We're not talking film here, are we? No, but we are talking about the fact that ever since Oskar Barnack invented the first 35mm stills camera that eventually became the Leica, we have basically stuck to that 3:2 ratio for all of our 35mm photography. And then when we went digital, since the early digital SLRs were based on basically they were modified bodies from film cameras, then the 3:2 ratio came along with them. Except for point-and-shoot cameras, the only ones to vary from that, of course, have been Olympus, because the original 4/3 standard that was set down by Olympus and Kodak, now Olympus and Panasonic, and now Micro 4/3, that has a 4:3 ratio. People who shot medium format always use different ratios anyway. They were either square, or they were 6:7, or they were 4.5:6. There are all sorts of different ratios, so we won't worry about that. Let's just say, though, that for most of us who are using an APS-C or a full-frame camera, that the image armature works quite well with that particular ratio. All right, enough about that. The image armature, all you need to take away from that is that diagonals are good, that if you have things that are at right angles to diagonals and head for a corner, that's also very good. And of course, if you actually break up the screen, you will notice that it will give you a grid that's very, very close to the rule of thirds. Then we went on to talk about golden mean. Well, the golden mean is, again, just another way of dividing the screen up into thirds, except this time they aren't thirds. They are based on a ratio of 1.615, and so on and so on. And that particular ratio, the only cameras I know that have a grid that shows that particular organization is my Olympus cameras. My Olympus cameras don't show a standard rule of thirds grid. Instead, they show the golden mean grid. So they actually have a larger section at the top, thinner in the middle, large again at the bottom. Large at one side, thinner in the middle, large again at the other side. So it's kind of a squeezed in version of the rule of thirds. But again, we're coming back to the fact that we just have two things so far: diagonals and rule of thirds. Both of those were elements that, well, they weren't elements. They were simply concepts. They were conceptualizations. They were constructs that we applied upon an image. Then we did leading lines. Now, leading lines put a whole different slant on things, because those lines were actually part of the image. In some cases, they may have been the focus of the entire image. Now, leading lines, what are they? Well, it could be a railway track, could be a stream, could be a plowed field, could be a fence, could be a meandering brook. It could be almost anything, as long as it leads you through the scene, Well, today I want to add another feature, and this one is also right there in the image, and that's contrast. Contrast means that your subject stands out from the background because they are either brighter or darker than that background. Now, many will say brighter than the background works better, but please, if you are looking at a picture of the tundra, which of course in winter is just a sea of white, and coming across that tundra is a caribou that is now a tawny brown, then that caribou is going to stand out because it's darker than that background. If you are somewhere where there is a grizzly bear racing across, it's even going to be more noticeable because he's darker color. So, contrast. Now, does it just have to be extremes? No, it can be subtle. The contrast might only be one shade of color that is enough different from the rest that it stands out. But typically, the more extreme the difference, the more noticeable your subject is going to be. And a brighter color subject against a darker background probably is a little more noticeable. So, stop and imagine now for a moment. You're framing up an image. You have a stream that's sort of one side is here, the other side is here. It seems to come in almost at right angles as it converges, but then it turns and it twists and it ends up right here. And right here against this background of dark greens and blues, you have a guy in a red coat, a very bright red coat. Right there. Now what have you got? You got leading lines. You have the image armature used because as this came in and this came up, they met sort of at right angles before they changed direction. So it kind of fits that image armature. That change of direction takes place pretty much at the thirds point, and your subject is pretty much at another thirds point. And your subject has a color that's not found in that natural environment, so they stand out. One of the members of our camera club refers to that not just as the focal point, but as the kicker. Because if you have something that stands out because it's much brighter or a very different color from everything else, you are automatically drawn to it. And of course, if we've got all those other elements working together, we now have what is possibly a fine composition. Now again, before we leave this topic, because I'm not going to say much more about contrast, contrast is almost self-evident. A dancer dressed in a pale pink outfit. She has blonde hair, she's pale skinned, she's dancing in a ballet like the Nutcracker, and as she goes across the stage, she goes away from the pastel background and is now silhouetted against, well, silhouetted is the wrong word because it's kind of an anti-silhouette. She's now well lit against the dark background of curtains behind her. That's contrast. So folks, contrast, look for it. See it. Could be contrast in color, texture, tone, any one of a number of things. Shape. You put one round object in a scene full of squares and rectangles, and that one round object is going to stand out because of its shape. You put something with a shiny, smooth texture on a piece of rough fabric, and it's going to stand out because of its texture. Now, I'm not going to add much more about composition. This is not going to be my last compositional video, but it may be the last one for a while because I need to sit back now and look and say, what else is there in composition that I could really talk about? But the takeaway for you in this video should be this. Study your images. Study the images that have been successful, that you like, that others like, that has gotten positive response, not just because of the subject matter, but because it was a properly composed image. Then look at some of the ones that were less successful. Even though they may have had a more interesting subject, people weren't as interested in the image. See if you can find out what you did right and what you did wrong. And see if any of it deals specifically with composition. Nowadays, modern cameras, if you leave them to their own devices, will do a pretty decent job of focusing. They will do a pretty decent job of setting the exposure correctly. So even the person who just leaves it on the most automatic mode and goes out taking pictures, if they are concentrating on composition, they're probably getting very good pictures, because the camera can take care of the techie stuff, but it can't think. And it's thinking. It's this part here that's about a foot or so behind the camera. That is where the real image comes from. So you have to supply that. Well, if you like this video, please give me a like. If you would like to see more of my videos, then subscribe to my channel. And of course, as I've always said, if you think there's anybody who might get something positive from this particular video, then by all means share it, and any others for that matter. I hope you're practicing. I hope you're getting out there and trying your best to improve your images, and not worrying about the gear, but worrying about the images. Like I've said before, pretty much all modern cameras are pretty darn decent when it comes to getting a decent picture. So, it's up to you to get the most out of them. Well, bye for now.